Canada controls nearly all of America's gas imports. Why Carney won't use it as a weapon. Before we get into tonight's story, there is one number we need to get exactly right, because getting it wrong would actually undersell how strange the situation really is. Canada does not supply 99% of the natural gas the United States uses. The United States produces the overwhelming majority of its own natural gas domestically, and is, in fact, the largest natural gas producer on Earth. But there is a different number, a real one published by Canada's own energy regulator, that is almost as strange as the myth, and it is this. Of all the natural gas the United States imports from anywhere in the world, from any country on the planet, close to 100% of it comes from Canada, not the gas America uses. The gas America has to bring in from outside its own borders. That distinction matters, and we're going to spend the next several minutes explaining exactly why. Because on the same weekend that trade talks between these two countries collapsed and 50% tariffs went into effect, Canada's Prime Minister was asked directly whether he intends to use exactly this kind of leverage, and the answer he gave was far more careful and far more revealing than a flat yes or no. Good evening. Tonight, we are talking about the one card in this entire trade war that Canada has so far refused to play, and what it would actually mean if that changed. Here's the question I want you thinking about as we go through this tonight, and I want your honest reaction in the comments. If a country holds decisive control over a resource its largest trading partner cannot easily replace, but that country's own leader keeps saying publicly that he sees no value in using it as a weapon, is that restraint a sign of responsible statesmanship? Or is it a missed opportunity at the exact moment leverage would matter most? I am genuinely curious which way you lean, so tell me below. Let's start with the actual numbers because they are more specific and more one-sided than most people following this story realize. According to Canada's energy regulator, in the most recent full year of data available, Canada supplied 60% of all the crude oil the United States imported from any country, and close to 100% of the natural gas the United States imported from any country. Canada also supplied 95% of the natural gas liquids the U.S. imported, and 85% of the electricity the United States imported across its northern border. Look specifically at natural gas for a moment because the trade in that commodity is almost comically lopsided. In the most recent year on record, Canada exported nearly 8 billion cubic feet of natural gas every single day, and essentially all of it went to the United States. In the same year, Canada imported natural gas too, about 2 billion cubic feet a day, and nearly all of that came from the United States as well. So this is not simply Canada selling and America buying. It is a fully integrated two-way pipeline system in which Canadian gas moves south to specific American regions, while American gas separately moves north to specific Canadian regions. And the entire arrangement works because nobody on either side of the border has ever had reason to assume it might stop. Oil tells a similarly stark story. The United States currently imports close to 4 million barrels of crude oil from Canada every single day, according to reporting that cites U.S. government trade data, a figure that represents nearly 2/3 of all the petroleum the United States imports from any country on Earth. 2/3, not from OPEC, not from Saudi Arabia, not from Venezuela or anywhere else, from one neighboring country, moving almost entirely through a fixed and finite number of pipelines that cross a single shared border. And this entire relationship, worth somewhere around $150 billion a year in combined energy trade according to United States government energy statistics, has up until this point in this 18-month trade war remained almost completely untouched by either side. Every round of tariffs, every retaliation, every suspended negotiation we have covered on this channel over the past several weeks has specifically carved out energy and left it alone. That is not an accident. That is two governments that both understand, whatever else they disagree about, that this particular wire is the one neither side actually wants to cut. Which brings us to the moment that makes tonight's story worth telling right now, rather than at any other point in this 18-month standoff. Back in late July, weeks before this weekend's collapse, Prime Minister Mark Carney was standing in Red Deer, Alberta, next to that province's premier, when a reporter asked him directly whether Canada would consider restricting energy exports to the United States as leverage in the ongoing trade fight. Carney's answer was not a yes, but it was also not the flat, reassuring no that a nervous market might have wanted to hear. "I don't see the value in it," he said. And then he explained why, in language that sounded less like a trade negotiator and more like someone protecting a long-term asset. "Being a reliable supplier is important," he said. "Canadians are reliable. Canadians can be trusted." And then the line that actually tells you the most about how he is thinking about this. "When you are a supplier of a key commodity, a key service," he said, "you have got to think really hard about not supplying it." Read that sentence carefully because it is doing something specific. Carney is not saying Canada will never use energy as leverage. He is saying that the decision to withhold a critical resource is expensive in ways that go beyond the immediate dollar figure, that a reputation for reliability, once damaged, does not come back easily, and that any government holding a card this powerful needs to weigh the long-term cost of playing it, not just the short-term satisfaction of finally having something the other side genuinely needs. That is a very different statement from either the flat refusal Washington might have preferred, or the aggressive threat that some voices inside Canada were actively pushing him to make. And there were voices pushing him loudly and specifically. At a meeting of Canada's provincial and territorial premiers earlier in July, the idea of using energy as a bargaining chip came up directly, and the provincial leaders split sharply along exactly the lines you would expect. Alberta and Saskatchewan, the two provinces that produce the overwhelming majority of Canada's oil and gas, shut the door on the idea entirely, unwilling to see their own resource sector turned into a political weapon that could just as easily damage their own long-term customers and reputation. But the premiers of Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick took the opposite position, arguing that everything should be on the table. Ontario's premier, Doug Ford, had already gone further than any other Canadian political leader on this question. Back in the spring of 2025, at the very start of this trade war, Ford threatened to, in his words, turn off the lights for roughly 1.5 million Americans in northern border states who rely on electricity imported from his province. More recently, Ford has argued publicly that Canada could, in his words, dismantle the United States economically if Ottawa and the provinces agreed to use energy exports as leverage together. That is about as blunt as a sitting Canadian premier has ever been about this option, and it stands in direct contrast to the far more cautious language Carney himself has consistently used. The federal government's own posture, when you look closely, has actually been more layered than either the hawks or the doves in this debate might prefer. In May, months before this latest collapse, Carney ruled out using energy and critical minerals as leverage in one breath, telling reporters Canadians honor their contracts and agreements, while, in the very next breath, suggesting that future integration of energy markets between the two countries remains an open question, given how Washington itself was treating the relationship. I reject that characterization of it as leverage, he said at the time. It's looking at, is it in our mutual interest to trade more? Where is it? And if it's not there, we have other options. That is a prime minister trying to hold two things at once, ruling out an aggressive energy weapon in public while quietly declining to promise unconditional, permanent supply, regardless of how Washington behaves. Canada's Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson put the underlying calculation more bluntly in a separate speech to a business audience in Toronto, describing the country's energy and natural resources sector as Canada's strongest cards in the broader renegotiation of the Continental Trade Agreement. Cards, plural, that a government has chosen so far not to play, is a very different thing from cards that do not exist. The American side, for its part, has been watching this exact debate unfold in Canada and has not stayed quiet about it. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer told a visiting group of Canadian politicians, trade envoys, and business leaders in Washington that Canada should not attempt to use its energy and natural resources as leverage in the ongoing negotiations over the Continental Trade Pact, and he framed the alternative in cooperative terms, saying the administration was looking to work with Canada on energy and critical minerals development in ways that would benefit both countries. That is, in essence, an American trade official standing in Washington and telling Canadian officials directly, please do not point the one weapon you actually have at us, in exchange for vaguer promises of future cooperation on exactly the resources being discussed. Whether that message was intended as reassurance or as a warning likely depends on which side of the negotiating table you were sitting on when it was delivered. Now overlay all of that context onto what actually happened this weekend. Trade talks collapsed late Friday night. 50% tariffs on a wide slate of Canadian goods took effect at 1 minute past midnight. Carney suspended negotiations and promised to match the American tariffs dollar for dollar. And at a press conference the following morning, when reporters specifically asked him whether he would now leverage Canada's critical minerals and energy in response, Carney did not repeat his earlier, more categorical answer from Red Deer. Instead, he offered something more careful, and in its own way more pointed. We have a range of other options, he said, without specifying what those options were. He described his government's next steps as intended to protect industries that are disadvantaged by American trade action. Deliberately general language that leaves the door open without walking through it. And when he did offer one specific example connected to energy, it was telling. He pointed to a pipeline project that allows Canada to export liquefied natural gas to markets in Asia, and said its value goes beyond a simple dollar figure because it makes the country less dependent on the United States in the first place. In other words, rather than threatening to cut off American energy supply directly, Carney's clearest recent statement on this topic was about reducing how much Canada needs the American relationship at all, a quieter, slower, and in some ways more durable form of leverage than an outright export restriction would be. That same weekend, Carney also used unusually direct language about the broader relationship, language that connects back to exactly this energy question, even when he was not explicitly discussing energy at all. "We've been under no illusions," he said. "We recognize from the start that America has changed." He went on to describe the decades-long process of steadily increasing integration between the two economies as, in his words, over. A striking thing for a Canadian Prime Minister to say about the country's largest trading partner and closest ally. Asked what message it sends to international businesses when the United States disregards terms it agreed to under existing trade law, he put it simply. "We have a deal," he said. Okay, what message does that send? None of those specific remarks were about energy directly, but when you place them next to his LNG comment and next to his refusal to give reporters a flat no on energy as leverage, they paint a consistent picture of a leader who has concluded that permanent, unconditional reliability toward the United States may no longer be the right long-term posture for Canada, even while he continues to resist the more aggressive immediate weaponization that premiers like Doug Ford have been pushing for. It is also worth understanding how consistently both governments have protected this specific relationship, even while attacking almost everything else. When the current trade war first began, back in February of last year, President Trump's initial executive order imposed 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian goods. But energy was singled out for a lower rate from the very first day, taxed at just 10%, while nearly everything else faced 2.5 times that burden. When the Section 338 tariffs that triggered this weekend's collapse were announced back in July, energy, potash, and critical minerals were again specifically carved out of the list, even as autos, dairy, alcohol, and dozens of manufactured goods categories were targeted directly. And when Canada's own earlier retaliatory tariffs were rolled back last September, ahead of what both governments hoped would be a durable trade agreement, energy had never been part of that retaliation to begin with. 3 separate governments, 2 American administrations worth of trade actions, and 1 consistent pattern. Whatever else gets weaponized in this fight, energy keeps getting quietly set aside on both sides, as though there is a shared, unspoken agreement that this particular relationship is simply too important and too mutually damaging to disrupt, to treat the same way as hockey sticks or cheese. The divide among Canada's own provincial leaders on this question is worth sitting with a little longer, because it is not simply a matter of aggressive premiers versus a cautious prime minister. It maps almost perfectly onto which provinces actually produce the energy in question and which ones do not. Alberta and Saskatchewan, the 2 provinces responsible for the overwhelming majority of Canada's oil and gas production, are also the 2 provinces most adamantly opposed to ever using that production as a political weapon, for the simple reason that any disruption to American demand lands first and hardest on their own economies, their own workers, and their own royalty revenues. Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, provinces with far less direct exposure to the oil and gas sector specifically, have been the loudest voices arguing that energy should be treated as fair game. That is not a coincidence, and it helps explain why Carney, governing a country where those provincial interests genuinely conflict with each other, has consistently reached for careful, hedged language, rather than picking a side in that internal argument. Whatever Ottawa eventually decides to do with this leverage, it will need the cooperation of Alberta specifically to actually implement it, since much of the physical infrastructure, the pipelines, the export terminals, and the wells themselves sits on provincial jurisdiction and under provincial political control. A federal prime minister threatening to use Alberta's oil as a bargaining chip without Alberta's own government on board is threatening something he may not actually have the practical authority to deliver. Electricity is the one part of this energy relationship where Ontario's threat actually could be carried out with comparatively little coordination from Alberta. And that is precisely why Doug Ford chose it as his opening move back in the spring of 2025, rather than reaching for oil or gas. Ontario and Quebec together generate more than half of all of Canada's electricity, much of it from hydroelectric dams that have been feeding power directly into the American Northeast for decades through dedicated transmission lines that, unlike oil pipelines, are controlled almost entirely at the provincial level. When Ford briefly imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 northern American states early in this trade war, he was demonstrating something specific, that a single Canadian province, acting largely on its own authority, could meaningfully raise the cost of power for a defined slice of the American population within days, not years. That episode, brief as it was, remains the closest either side has actually come to touching the energy relationship directly. And it is worth remembering as the backdrop every time Ford calls more broadly for Canada to consider using energy as leverage again. He has already shown, on a small scale, that he is willing to act on that instinct, even when the federal government in Ottawa is urging caution. Canada has not restricted, reduced, or threatened a specific cutoff of any energy export to the United States. The $20 to $28 billion tariff fight that erupted this weekend covers dairy, alcohol, building materials, electronics, and a long list of manufactured goods. It does not touch oil, gas, potash, or critical minerals, all of which have been specifically and repeatedly carved out of every tariff action either government has taken throughout this entire 18-month dispute. That carve-out is not a footnote. It is arguably the most important fact in this entire story, because it tells you that both governments, whatever else they are willing to fight over, have so far treated the energy relationship as the one part of this partnership too dangerous, too mutually damaging to actually put on the table. So what would it actually look like if that changed, and how much economic force does Canada genuinely hold here? Consider the natural gas picture specifically, because it is the most extreme example. If Canada were to meaningfully restrict pipeline gas flowing into the American Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, or New England, those specific regions do not have an easy alternative source sitting nearby. Unlike crude oil, which can arrive by tanker from a dozen different countries given enough time and enough price tolerance, pipeline natural gas moves through fixed infrastructure that took decades to build and cannot simply be rerouted to a different supplier overnight. That is precisely why the near total Canadian share of America's natural gas imports matters so much more than the raw percentage of overall American consumption it represents. It is not that America would run out of gas nationally, it is that specific, defined American regions, with millions of homes and businesses, and in winter real public safety stakes tied to heating supply, have functionally no alternative pipeline source if that particular tap were ever meaningfully turned down. The timing of any such move would matter enormously, and this is a detail that rarely makes it into the more dramatic headlines about this leverage. Natural gas demand in the northern United States is highly seasonal, spiking hard in the depths of winter when heating load surges. A restriction imposed in August, when this trade war happens to be escalating, would land very differently than the same restriction imposed in January, when it would collide directly with peak heating demand in exactly the American states least able to absorb a supply shock. That seasonal reality gives whichever government controls the timing of any future escalation an additional lever beyond the raw commodity itself. And it is one reason energy analysts who study this relationship tend to treat any Canadian energy threat delivered outside of winter as considerably less credible than the same threat delivered in December or January, when the pressure it could apply would be dramatically higher. That is also exactly why every energy analyst who has weighed in publicly on this question keeps landing on the same word Carney himself used back in Red Deer: reliability. An energy expert cited in reporting on this debate pointed out that if Canada actually stopped shipping crude oil south, the country would in practice need to cut its own production to match, since Canada's own pipeline and refining infrastructure is not built to redirect that volume of oil to other buyers overnight either. In other words, this is not a lever Canada could pull cleanly in isolation without inflicting real, immediate damage on its own oil and gas sector, the workers employed by it, and the provincial governments, especially Alberta's, that depend heavily on its revenue. That is the actual unglamorous reason this weapon has stayed in its holster for 18 months of an otherwise increasingly bitter trade war. It is not that Canada lacks the raw physical leverage. The numbers we started with tonight prove that leverage is real. It is that using it would be closer to mutually assured economic damage than a clean, one-sided victory, which is exactly the calculation Carney has been describing publicly, carefully, and consistently every single time a reporter has pushed him to rule it in or out. There is one more piece of this picture worth spending time on, because it may end up mattering more than any single tariff or threat, and that is the slower, structural shift already underway in Canada's own energy exports, independent of anything either government decides to do this week. Carney's government has spent the past year actively fast-tracking new liquefied natural gas export capacity aimed specifically at Asian markets rather than the United States, designating major projects for streamlined federal approval and pushing legislation intended to speed up construction of exactly the kind of infrastructure that would let Canadian gas reach buyers in Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere without ever touching an American pipeline. Industry projections suggest Canadian LNG export capacity could approach 6 billion cubic feet per day within the next several years. If all of the currently proposed terminals are built, a figure that would represent a meaningful new outlet for Canadian gas that does not run through American demand at all. That project timeline is measured in years, not months, so it will not change the balance of power in this specific trade war happening right now. But it does mean that the extraordinary numbers we started with tonight, close to total Canadian control over America's natural gas imports, may look meaningfully different a decade from now. Not because Canada chose to cut America off, but because Canada quietly built itself other customers, while the two countries kept fighting over tariffs on hockey sticks and cheese. So here is where this actually stands tonight, And it is a more complicated picture than either the Canada has all the power framing or the Canada would never dare framing fully captures. The raw numbers are real and are not in dispute. Close to all of the natural gas the United States imports from any country comes from Canada. Nearly 2/3 of America's imported petroleum comes from Canada. 85% of America's imported electricity comes from Canada. Those figures make Canada, by a wide margin, the single most important external energy supplier the United States has, in a relationship worth roughly $150 billion a year. And yet, through 18 months of escalating tariffs, a suspended negotiation, a matching round of retaliatory duties now being finalized, and a prime minister who has publicly declared that the old, seamlessly integrated relationship between these two economies is over, that specific lever has not been touched by either government. Carney has repeatedly said he does not see the value in pulling it. He has just as repeatedly declined to promise he never will. And in his most recent comments, delivered in the same week this trade war reached its sharpest point yet, he pointed not toward cutting off American energy supply, but toward quietly building alternative markets in Asia that would make Canada need that supply relationship less over time. A strategy that looks less like a threat and more like a country hedging against a partner it has decided it can no longer fully rely on. Whether that quieter, slower form of leverage, reducing dependence rather than weaponizing supply, ends up mattering more than an outright export restriction ever could, is a question nobody can answer definitively tonight. What we can say is that the option exists, that senior officials on both sides of the border know exactly how much weight it carries, and that the American trade representative himself has already gone out of his way to publicly ask Canada not to use it, which is not the kind of request a government makes about a threat it considers empty. There's a broader lesson sitting inside this specific story that applies well beyond just oil and gas, and it is worth naming plainly before we close. Over the course of this 18-month trade war, we have watched both governments repeatedly threaten, impose, and retaliate against each other across a huge range of sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, dairy, lumber, alcohol, and now a long list of manufactured goods caught up in this weekend's 50% tariff. Each of those fights has been genuinely damaging to the specific workers and companies involved, but none of them has touched the one relationship that would actually threaten the physical functioning of the other country's economy in the most literal, immediate sense. Heat in the winter, fuel in the tank, electricity on the grid. Those are worth something different than tariffs on hockey sticks in a trade war. A restriction on natural gas moving into New England in January would be something closer to an act that either side would need to weigh with an entirely different level of seriousness. So far, remarkably, given everything else that has happened this year, neither government has been willing to cross that particular line, even as the language surrounding almost everything else in this relationship has grown sharper and more confrontational by the week.